Hey, Andy. Hey, Colleen.
Hey, how's it going?
Morning.
Morning. How are you guys doing?
Doing well.
Yeah.
These Zoom things always seem like the Brady Bunch to me. Like you look down at the other person and up at the other person.
It's always hard to tell who's staring at who. Colleen, I finally got the YouTube to work on my computer. I'm so excited.
Amazing.
Crazy. After 2 months of it not working. Hey, Jason.
Good morning. How are you doing, Lindsay?
Good. How are you doing?
Doing great. Summer's here. I think we can officially say that now.
Yeah.
Morning, Jason.
Yeah.
I realized yesterday walking outside during lunch that it is officially Louisiana in the summertime.
Yeah, like the walks to the Capitol have gotten warmer and warmer every day, man. So it's
I know. It doesn't
definitely
bode well for
summertime.
July and August.
Nope, it does not. Oh goodness. All right. Well, I think I know that we got a note from Brent that he's not going to be able to join us. So just say the word when you're ready to get started.
What do you think, Jason? We can wait maybe 1 or 2 more minutes for everyone.
You got it.
That sounds great.
And folks who just joined, we're waiting about another minute or so for everyone else to join. We're getting started shortly. All right, Lindsay, what do you think? You ready to get started?
Whenever you're ready, Jason.
All right, well, great. Look, I'd like to go ahead and call this May 27th meeting of our Climate Task Force Mining and Oil and Gas Committee to order. Can you get a second?
Second.
Thank you. All right, so next thing on our agenda is the approval of the minutes. I know that Lindsay sent these out in addition to some of the actions in a previous email, so I'd like to get those meeting minutes approved as well. Need a second on that as well?
Second.
Thank you. All right, so we have an action-packed agenda today. I will kick things off today. Just want to let folks know Brent had something that came up this morning and will not be able to join us this morning. So be doing this meeting with Lindsay and the help of other folks. So I also want to just say thank you to all. Obviously, I have gotten a strong impression that when Lindsay and the other folks give you guys homework, that y'all take it very seriously based on what I've read the last few weeks. So the comments that we received on the actions were impressive. I think that they were thoughtful and obviously showed that folks are taking the roles on this committee very seriously. And I want to just thank all of you and commend you for taking the time to do that. I think that the insight shown is really indicating that we're moving in the right direction. I think that when you look at the monumental task of where Louisiana is in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, being able to think through this in a very objective manner and people bringing great ideas to the table is going to help us to move a lot of these initiatives forward. So again, I want to thank you for taking the time. I know it's not always easy to take a step back and put thoughts on paper. And again, I think that doing these meetings virtually makes it even an additional challenge just because we're not all sitting in the same room and collaborating. So thanks for working through those challenges and really getting, I think, some really good information together. I really think that we're gonna end up with some great actions and recommendations at the end of the meeting. So with that, I will kick it over to Lindsay to start on just kind of the actions overview and kind of walk us through where we're going to be going today. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Jason. Do you mind if I start with a roll call real quick?
Not at all. Sorry.
No, not a problem at all. Jason Linklow. Jason's here. Brent Campbell. Brent is not. Adam Peltz.
Here.
Al Collins.
Present.
Thanks, Al. Andy Jacoby.
Sorry, Jacoby. Yes, I'm here.
Jacoby. Thanks, Andy.
Oh.
Brian Johnston. I see Brian there. Donaldson Caffrey. I don't see him yet. Dr. Richard Hughes.
Yep.
Hi, Dr. Hughes. Glenn Lyons.
Here.
Hi, Glenn. John Sparling. Let's see, John. Christy Trail. Lori LeBlanc.
I'm here, thank you.
Hey, Lori. Mark Gebbia. Selby Bush. Stacy Methvin. Tom Broom.
Present.
Hi, Tom. William Daniel. And Wynn Radford. Okay, great. Thanks, members, for being here today. And as Jason mentioned, we're going to spend most of our time today in a working session discussing the actions that you all put forward and that were put forward by other members relevant to oil and gas in this conversation. So just to start with some desired outcomes for this meeting, our goal is really to allow the opportunity of discussing the actions received in this sector, hearing from you guys what are interesting ideas, what are areas of further focus. Particularly in this group, there were some really great ideas put forward around legacy infrastructure and reducing fugitive emissions. So spending some time today thinking through the actions that were put forward by all of you and how we can begin to move them forward. But really, as we're moving forward in this process, our governor's office team will be taking the lead on refining and gap filling, organizing and improving actions over the next couple of months. And we'll be leaning on the expertise of you all as we do this in moving forward. So our hope for the discussion today is to lean on your collective expertise and your perspective and experience in this sector as we begin to identify and address those actions. So I'll just kick us off with an overview of where we are in our whole planning process, just to set the table for our discussion. And then we'll spend most of the time going through those action proposals. And I just want to note Colleen McHugh from the Water Institute is on our call today. She'll be helping with the discussion and also taking notes that we'll send out to you guys after as points of follow-up and next steps that we want to keep doing to move this all forward. Just to bring us back to something that's very familiar at this point, our decision-making process that we're using, the SDM decision-making process. So the role of the sector committees has really been focused in this third step of identifying alternatives, really laying it all out there in this action development process of what can we move forward? How can we reduce emissions in Louisiana? And at the same time that you guys have been focused on identifying actions and alternatives in the third step, our advisory groups have been working in this fourth step of forecasting consequences and beginning to understand how high-level strategies impact our fundamental objectives that we discussed with you all over the first few months of this effort. So in that third step of action development, through the April 30th deadline, we received 171 action ideas across all of our sectors, and then some that were cross-sector and economy-wide measures. So you guys in oil and gas received 31 actions, and that was pretty standard across our different groups, between 30 and 40 actions, which is a really incredible place for us to start as we begin to think about emission reduction in these sectors that we have. So you'll note that these numbers don't all add up to 171. A lot of groups are going to be reviewing similar actions, or you guys in oil and gas are looking at some actions that manufacturing and industry is also looking at, or that the power group is looking at, or that might have economy-wide implications that we put in the cross-sector lens as well. So we're trying to ensure there's that cross-disciplinary review. So you might find that there are a few actions in our discussion today that are more relevant to a different committee, but wanted to put on your radar so we can think through these actions in a different lens. So as I mentioned, while you guys have been working on actions, wanted to give you a little perspective on what the advisory groups have been doing over the past couple of months, mainly because that's where actions will go from here. That's how we'll be doing the evaluation of actions. So as I mentioned a minute ago, the advisory groups are focused in that fourth step of forecasting consequences in the process. So we're doing 2 rounds of analysis in evaluation with the advisory groups throughout this process. So the first one is happening now, actually just finished a few weeks ago at the high level of evaluating what do big picture views of the future look like for Louisiana through different high level hypothetical emission reduction scenarios. So this first pass of evaluation was very high level. We took strategies that you all as sector committees discussed in the March meetings and built some portfolios, some high level portfolios of what emission reduction could look like in Louisiana. And those portfolios are just a way to organize the high level strategies that you guys talked through. And so we're using these portfolios in the beginning half of this year as we start to set priorities overall and begin to think through at a high level what emission reduction needs to look like in Louisiana. But as we move into the second half of the year, we'll be bringing in actions that you all are working on now and in our meeting today to refine those portfolios so we can bring in more granular level of analysis and information by the advisory groups. So they'll be adding that in as we move into August and September into the second half of the year for a more detailed evaluation. And in both rounds of evaluation, what we're evaluating against are those fundamental objectives that we set forth in the beginning of this effort. So yes, it does include emission reduction potential, but it also includes quality of life, equity, economy, environment, resilience, short and long-term success. It's really taking that holistic approach of emission reductions based on what we and the task force deemed fundamental at the beginning of this effort. Just to give you a little insight into what these portfolios look like in the first round. So again, at that high level, we organize strategies into 5 different portfolios. that represented these hypothetical future scenarios. And we could really determine would the future of Louisiana look like if we just turn the dial up on strategies in all of these different portfolios. So the first one is a business as usual case. So this helps us understand what the consequences of inaction are. And then the other four alternatives are that hypothetical, turning the dial all the way up. What is the most amount of emission reduction potential and the biggest impact that we could get from fully pursuing intensive electrification through zero carbon renewable energy? Similarly, what would be the implications of fully pursuing reduced energy demand, consumption, and waste, and then industrial carbon removal, capture, use, and storage, and lastly, natural sequestration and sinks. So we understand that we're not teeing this up for the task force to choose one of these portfolios in the summertime when we present them with the results of this analysis in their meeting in 2 weeks, actually. But we understand it's going to be a combination of all of these portfolios or of different types of portfolios. So we want the task force to understand what are the implications of these different portfolios, more so than choosing one, to understand what are the maximum benefits and limitations of these different approaches. And again, these were very high level in the first round. They didn't frame any sort of granular understanding or input on action specifically. So that's what we'll be working towards in the second round. This was just the high level to tease out some of those high level priorities. We've gotten this question a lot on where do actions go from here. So actions were submitted by April 30th. They were posted on the website. You can see that third step is where we are today. We've sorted proposals into the sectors and we're discussing them with committees in these last 2 weeks of May. That's what we've been doing. And the task force June 8th meeting will report out to them on the actions that have been received. And as I mentioned on that first slide, all the way on the right, as we move forward in these summer months, the governor's office, our planning team, will be working to organize and combine gap fill and group strategies to create a cohesive picture of emission reduction in Louisiana. Understanding there's a lot of interconnectedness across groups, we might need to do some gap filling and organizing, moving from just the raw proposals that we received. And if you look all the way on the bottom right of this graphic, this was what I referred to with then organizing the actions and strategies for this second round of evaluation. And then as we move to the left on the bottom, portfolios will be evaluated against our fundamental objectives by the advisory groups. And you all will have an opportunity to meet again in September to refine and just work through any last details on actions in this sector based on the feedback from advisory groups in the evaluation in that August-September timeframe. And then as we keep moving to the left, the task force will then start to make decisions and understand trade-offs across different actions and strategies before finally deciding on what the final action portfolio looks like for our report. So that's when we're trying to hone in on and move towards what our final strategies and actions are looking like in this process. So this is how we're going to get there in the next couple of months. Just to frame that in terms of our timeline, you guys are meeting here in late May. We'll have a few task force meetings in the summer, again, to look at the high level pictures, beginning to understand the high level paths to emission reduction as our planning team is working on those details of action development with you all offline. And then in that second round of evaluation in the summer, you guys will be able to come back together in September to revise actions based on feedback before the task force has all of those fall and winter meetings to make the final decisions. So this is where we are in the process. And just before moving into actions, I wanted to see if anyone had questions on what you guys as sector committees are doing or the advisory group evaluations. And if not, I'll move forward, but I'll just pause for a moment here. Okay, great. Hearing no questions, we'll then move into the action proposals for this sector. I'll just start here by framing up some of the strategies that we took from the discussions that you guys had in March and have developed out and included actions underneath here that have been received in this sector. So as I mentioned earlier, there is a lot of overlap in the actions that you guys received in oil and gas and then in the manufacturing and industry. But in this meeting, we'll focus more on the upstream and the midstream emissions, even though it is very interconnected to downstream and the manufacturing processes. But we'll bring in that lens of more focusing on the up and midstream processes so that you guys can bring in a different perspective to some of those actions as well. So a few different components that we're looking at here, as I mentioned, you all put forward some great actions around addressing legacy infrastructure and fugitive emissions and flaring. We'll also think through a little bit more broadly reducing carbon intensity of up and midstream processes. There were also some great actions around exploring market mechanisms, different carbon financing frameworks and systems, alongside financial incentives for decarbonization. And then we'll take a look at some different monitoring actions that were put forward and then diving into the deployment of carbon capture technology and infrastructure. A few different components of what that looks like alongside the blue and green hydrogen question, which we spent a lot of time in that March meeting discussing. So I'll frame at a very high level the actions that were received and just pose a few broad questions on these slides to give you the overall picture of what we're looking at. And then we'll come back and go slide by slide, think through strategy by strategy, what emission reduction actions we can look at and further dive into on these slides, if that sounds good with everyone. So on this first component of addressing legacy infrastructure, I think one thing that we can think through here, and I'd love to hear from Adam, Christy, Andy, and Brent on the actions that they all put forward in this category, but on the weakening of wells over time and how do we begin to take these first steps towards plugging weakened wells and addressing these legacy sites and ensuring that they are plugged and cleaned up. There are a lot of great options that are offered here, and where are those first steps we can begin to take? What do operators need to take versus the state and federal government as well? And what are those different ways that we can push on those different mechanisms in legacy infrastructure? As we turn to reducing fugitive emissions and flaring, there were a few actions here around increasing monitoring of methane as we're moving more towards remote sensing and understanding data science. How can we leverage new technology for leak detection and also new technology on the plugging of leaks as well? And so there were a few actions here around just what types of equipment do we need to be looking at? What types of technology just on monitoring leaks can we be utilizing? I know there was some emphasis on the EPA LDAR program and some other options that were put forward we can dive into on this slide as well. And when we're thinking about reduced carbon intensity and footprint of upstream and midstream processes, many of these actions were put forward or proposed by our manufacturing and industry committee on streamlining the permitting of decarbonization projects specific to manufacturing, creating a state carbon intensity database of measuring decarbonization at the industry scale, of creating an industry certification program to highlight emission reduction in facilities, of prioritizing carbon light opportunities over carbon capture, assessing industry risk on communities. So though a lot of these are focused on the downstream operations, I wanted to bring to the attention of you all so we can think of opportunities to decarbonize and reduce carbon intensity in the up and midstreams. So just a way to think through some of the actions that were framed more on the downstream side. How can we also consider that upstream as well on the permitting and the monitoring side too? As we're looking towards the market mechanisms and financial incentives, there were 3 actions put forward on some broad carbon pricing frameworks, which is very important in industry, also in power and transportation, just decarbonization economy-wide. So wanted to think through with you guys where we start here. And there were recommendations that we pursue more regional or national or international mechanisms. So what do we want the role of the state to look like in this? Where can we where can we see those opportunities here? And then a few actions as well on decarbonization tax incentives, a few put forward by CF Industries and one by Lamoga as well, that we can walk through and begin to think as we're getting back to those decarbonization mechanisms, how do we financially incentivize a move towards that in the future? And there were a lot of options and actions on how we increase deployment of carbon capture technology and infrastructure. This is something that Jason and I have spoken to, and I know he has some good ideas on where we are now in the process and what of these actions can speak to where we are in the process now, where Louisiana is moving forward, and just what are the different components that can be used from the actions that have been put forward. I know a few of them more fall into the federal jurisdiction versus the state, so we'll be able to dive into that in this conversation as well. There were a few actions put forward around the transparency, feasibility, integrity, and environmental justice components of CCUS. So again, thinking through how does this fit into the current processes and the ongoing work that has been happening at the federal level and also at the state level, beginning to think about that integration with the important equity and EJ components that were proposed as well. And just this last slide, in the March meeting, we had spoken some to the blue and green hydrogen and alternative fuel technology. I know this is a pretty expensive technology right now for green hydrogen. So what types of incentives or what types of technology needs to be developed so that we can prepare and transition and understand moving towards green hydrogen in the future and other alternative fuels? CF Industries put forward an interesting action around a hydrogen investment income tax credit to encourage the move towards green hydrogen, so we can think through other ways to encourage and move towards that transition of green hydrogen. So those are all of the strategies and actions that were received in this sector. And I'll move us back to this first slide and pass it over to Jason, if you'd like to tee up our discussion on addressing legacy infrastructure, and we can just move through these strategies one by one, if that works.
Sounds great, Lindsay. So on legacy infrastructure, and I apologize for Brent not being here today. That's kind of his wheelhouse, but I'll do my best to capture some of the discussion that we had earlier. Right now, just I think these comments are very well timed. There's a lot of discussion on just having a significant need that much outweighs, the amount of funding that's available to address that need. So I think that, just getting folks familiar with, how those procedures work, putting in place the policy recommendations on what we can do to try to increase awareness and increase funding to address legacy infrastructure. Those comments are very well received as well. We are actually working right now with our federal delegation and other folks on funding. They have indicated to us that there's potential for additional funding that could come to Louisiana to help address the program. I know that Secretary Harris and others have testified that there's a significant need for Louisiana to get additional funding to address legacy infrastructure. So from reading through the comments, I think that those were very well thought out in terms of, what we need to do to address them big picture wise in Louisiana. But I think the bulk of our focus right now is on trying to secure additional federal funding to try to supplement the existing funding mechanism that we have in the state. So I think that, again, Brent could expound upon that a lot better than I can, but I know that it's something that our Office of Conservation takes very seriously, and for us, we have again engaged with DOE and other folks to indicate to them how important this is for Louisiana.
Thanks, Jason. That's really great to hear. It's exciting too I think in the American Jobs Plan and some of the other draft federal infrastructure legislation, there is much potential for funding around addressing legacy infrastructure, which is a really great opportunity. And with that, Adam, Christy, and Andy, and Christy, I saw that you were able to join us this morning. Would you guys be able to talk through a few of these actions that you did frame really well, just for the edification of the group, so we can start thinking through those components?
I can talk a little bit about them, and but Christy and Adam and Brent, whoever's on, can sort of jump in as well. And so you want me to go sort of maybe one by one and just say very briefly what they are?
That'd be great.
I think there's a couple of things that, that we definitely have federal funds that are going to be coming to the state, and that's wonderful. The more federal funds that can help us plug abandoned wells that are leaking methane, the better it will be, not just for climate change, but there's a lot of other reasons that it's great, of course, as well. But additionally, it's not just that there's a static number of abandoned wells that need to be plugged and then the problem is solved, because right now, DNR, the Office of Conservation, and the Oilfield Site Restoration Commission is continually adding orphan wells to the list, adding wells to the orphan well list. And so the number is going up far faster than we're plugging them. So even with a bunch of federal dollars coming in, it's not going to stem the problem, which is that every month that passes, we're adding more and more to the list. So there's, I think it goes, federal funds go hand in hand with just getting DNR to enforce existing laws and even to shore up some of the shortcomings and the loopholes in the regulations. And so what we've sort of focused on, the first would be to let me just, my list here is a little bit out of order. I'll say the improve the oilfield site restoration funding to plug and abandoned wells. And so we think that we need to increase the fund's cap so that more of the fees that are already being assessed are continuing to flow into the fund, so that there are more wells that are able to be plugged. And so we're trying to come up with things that are consistent with the auditor's general conclusions, and so we're recommending that the legislature remove the cap on the OSR fees. We're asking the legislature to increase the OSR fee from 1.5 cents per barrel to 9 cents per barrel, to remove the exemptions and the reductions in fees, that is for things like triple wells and incapable wells, and to increase the orphan well surcharge to the drill permit fee by 150%. All those things are going to improve funding so that our existing oilfield site restoration commission and the many operators who are represented on that commission are going to be able to address the problem more fully. So that is that's really the second of your bullet points there, Lindsay. I can go on with this, but if Brent or Christy or Adam, if you guys want to, I'll give you a second if you want to chime in. Just stop me on that. Okay, I know we need to move forward, so I'll try and be. Oh, go ahead.
Well, yeah, no, Andy, this is Adam. I was going to say that please continue, and I can backfill with some national perspective at the right moment.
Okay, I'll try and be succinct here. The next is the first bullet point, which is to ensure that former operators are held responsible for their orphan wells. We already know that operators are legally responsible, but there's no one at DNR that's necessarily holding them accountable. And so we were going to suggest that the legislature pass legislation that would make a series of changes, really 9 small but very meaningful changes to the law that would ensure that responsible parties include all the former operators and everyone who has been operating that well in the past. So that would allow things like landowners to force operators to do what they're already legally bound to do. It would be to mandate that the DNR review operator information to, there's a problem where orphan well operators are able to simply walk away from their wells and start new LLCs, and DNR does a poor job of blocking them from being able to create new LLCs and continue to operate. And so that's one of lots of these little sort of reforms that will ensure that operators who are legally bound to plug the wells actually do so. And it sort of would basically affect only the sort of bad operators that don't plug wells. The third bullet point is reform future utility laws and rules to prevent inactive wells from unduly lingering unplugged. And that's simply an effort, it sort of speaks for itself, which is that the legislature should pass legislation that mandates that that wells, it's meant to address the problem of future utility wells lingering on the future utility list indefinitely. So it requires that the DNR take a hard look, and it gives a lot of power to the DNR to make sure that only inactive wells are on that list for good cause, because and that they have additional financial security, because we know that those wells, per the auditor, are more likely to become orphan wells, particularly the longer that they sit out there on the list. And then the fourth would be to improve, excuse me, to improve financial security to ensure that legacy sites are plugged and cleaned up. We obviously need to improve security because there are so many shortcomings in the security amounts. This was something that was highlighted by the auditor, and so we think that the financial security needs to be meaningful in order for it to be effective, and it needs to be enough to cover the plugging of the well. At the very least, the plugging of the well, also to clean up the site and to remove all the equipment from it, but which is part of the legal mandate. But at the very least, it should cover plugging the wells. And I think there was an article by Lee Zurich just a day or so ago that highlighted how the shortcomings here and the significant problems with the failure to have adequate financial security, also highlighted by the auditor. So what we try to do is make our suggestions in line with the auditor, either specifically or just generally based on what the auditor has said is needed. But there are so many loopholes that we have a lot of little things here to prevent the accumulation of new orphan wells and new abandoned wells that are just going to cause more and more methane problems. There is another sort of a fifth issue, which is that, but actually that was something that Brent was more involved with, and so I'd like to defer to him. I'm not sure if he's here. I can't really speak to it though. But Adam, you might be able to. But that's pretty much it from our end.
And so this is Adam, and what I can add is that this is well seen in the context of states across the country considering very similar proposals in light of the possibility of major federal stimulus to plug existing orphan wells. Both pieces of legislation in the House and Senate that address this issue have incentives for states to improve their financial assurance, idle well management, and well transfer programs as a way to unlock additional money. And Louisiana can use all of the money it can get on this front. And so at the most recent Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission meeting, that's the Association of State Oil and Gas Regulators that's been around since the 1930s and is chaired by a rotating cast of governors. At their last meeting, every state has 5 minutes to talk about the chief issues of concern. And just about every single state talked about legacy infrastructure management at this past meeting. I've never seen so much interest in a single issue in the 10 years I've been tracking it. And lots of states are undergoing rulemakings and policy adjustments that are more or less in line with what's been suggested here in these action templates. And I'll point to an example in Arkansas, which around 2 or 3 years ago adopted a rule requiring full cost bonding for stripper wells upon transfer. And that one rule would just by itself go a tremendously long way in reducing future orphan well burden in Louisiana. And so if Arkansas can do it, then surely Louisiana can too. And there's a lot of other good stuff in these proposals, each of which would chip away at future orphan well burden and taken together would really make a huge difference. And of course, the purpose of this, in a climate context, is these wells emit methane, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas, and contaminate groundwater on top of that. And so it's really a win-win to get these wells plugged in a timely fashion with private capital whenever possible.
Thanks, Adam, for that context. My question for you is going to be around those two components exactly. So how do we use the existing or the potential federal opportunities to either jumpstart these programs or to target specific opportunities that make it more feasible to address legacy infrastructure, and any specific language that you see around that as it relates to the actions you guys put forward. And then on the other side, case studies of what other states have done to address that infrastructure. So Adam, do you see any of those specific potential opportunities? And we can always coordinate offline. I know it's hard to keep it on the top of your mind.
Yeah, so if, first of all, there's always a big if with federal legislation. Who knows what's going to happen over the next few months? I think there's reason for optimism given how widespread interest is in orphan well plugging and site remediation from across the country and across the political spectrum. But, again, you never know. If good news occurs and these bills pass in, more or less the way that they're currently structured, there would be large chunks of money that would flow instantly to start plugging the existing catalog of documented orphan wells, which is somewhere between close to 4,000 in Louisiana. And then there is a chunk of funding that would flow for several different triggers. One would be to do rulemakings that would improve plugging regulations, which is to say, making sure that when wells are plugged, they don't leak over time. A second would be for these improvements on financial assurance, idle well management, and well transfers. Both of those would trigger $20 million, up to $20 million additional grants from the federal government, which goes a fairly long way. And then a third area is, to the extent that the orphan well fund increases in Louisiana, the federal government under the proposed legislation would match those increases. So, if you went up by $1 million a year on average over what the last 10 years have been, the feds would match that with another $1 million. And that has a $30 million cap, I think, over the course of a decade. So there's actually a fair bit of money that could be collected that way. And a lot of these proposals would fall under those categories of incentives.
Thanks, Adam. That's
And then
really great to hear
Lindsay,
about those opportunities.
Yeah. And you had a second question, which I misplaced in my mind.
Yeah, it was around other case studies, and I apologize for the background noise. But my second question was around case studies. You mentioned Arkansas, but I was curious what other measures that other states have taken in this.
Yeah, so North Dakota adopted a similar provision to Arkansas, and they also adopted a provision that limited the number of inactive wells on a blanket bond to 6. And so this has historically been a problem where blanket bond amounts are very low compared to the large number of wells that are covered under them. And so you could have pennies on the dollar in the case of a bankruptcy with a large number of wells covered under a blanket bond. The biggest risk is these inactive wells because they're not producing the revenue that would pay for their plugging. And so North Dakota took the step of saying these, higher risk wells, you can't have them under a blanket bond. You need to have them under a single well bond. And that's been, that's been part of North Dakota's been aggressive on this issue. Alaska recently upped its bond amounts by almost a factor of 10 to try to align them with the actual cost of plugging. California has been doing something similar. And then you can look to, Texas and Oklahoma both have industry funds to plug orphan wells. I'm not saying they're the models for the nation, but they're worth looking at. Texas raises around $20 million a year from the industry and plugs 1,400 wells a year with that money, which is definitely by far the most in the country. Of course, it's still not enough to keep up with the number of orphans they have, but it's something to take a look at. Alabama has been very aggressive about hunting down responsible parties and not letting people shape-shift into other LLCs to escape their liability. And so that's a non-rule but sort of programmatic change that can help reduce orphan well burden as well. And I could work up some other examples from other states with specific language and send it along to you in the coming weeks.
That would be great, Adam. It's really exciting to hear that there's a lot of other opportunities and case studies that Louisiana can learn from in this. And possibly you, Brent, and I can connect on that. That would be great.
Just a short note about that to follow up on what Adam said is that the Louisiana Legislative Auditor's report on DNR's oil field, the orphan well problem, the original report, which I think was 2016 or earlier, highlighted a bunch of the other states and compared them to Louisiana. So there's that split screen with a bunch of other states and what the legislative auditors sort of suggested were stronger compared to our own states. But that said, I think the idea of Adam putting together some really good comparisons would be awesome.
Thanks, Andy. Christy, I know that you were also a lead author on these actions. Do you have any additional comments in addition to what Adam and Andy talked to?
I wouldn't classify myself as a lead author. I really credit Adam and Andy and Brent for, taking on the bulk of the work. And it's just great to have Adam's perspective on the work going on around the rest of the country. So no, I think they captured everything perfectly. Thank you.
That's great. So the only action that is on addressing legacy infrastructure not proposed by this committee was this idea of an abandoned well administration pilot program. And just in reading the proposal, it's offering the idea to take financially orphaned wells, as well as other wells for surveying and cataloging, evaluation, plugging and abandonment, remediation and reclamation, redevelopment and monitoring, that all could be done and monitored through this abandoned well task force. So I'd be interested if you guys have any comments or thoughts on if that can be integrated with other actions that we've been thinking through, if that would be just an additional beneficial layer in addressing legacy infrastructure.
I'll make the brief point that the proposal as it was submitted was adapted from Megan Bivens, who works on national abandoned oil fields issues. And she's done a ton of really good research on this issue. And she feels that the New Mexico example is a very good example of something to emulate. And I've traded messages with her. This is the first time I'm seeing the action item suggestion, but I like the idea. I mean, I don't think of it as being something exclusive. I think that the other sort of reform proposals are very strong, but I definitely like the proposal submitted by Jane Patton and Logan Burke.
That's great to hear. We can also discuss with them more on this proposal, understanding this proposal.
Yeah.
Any final comments on legacy infrastructure? I'm glad we parked here for a while. So our next category to think through is reducing fugitive emissions and flaring. So as I mentioned when we first walked through this slide, I see some potential here on the leak detection technology and then the technology itself and ability to plug those leaks. So I'm interested from you guys how current methane regulations can be strengthened to cut the up and midstream emissions and reduce waste, and what are the life cycle of some of these assets. And then on the flip side, thinking through where do we need to improve methane monitoring. I know remote sensing is an area where we're moving in the future. We talked with DEQ a lot about this, so maybe Brian might be able to chime in on the remote sensing capabilities as well. Any initial ideas or thoughts on fugitive emissions?
So this is Adam again, and I would invite Elizabeth Paranos, who is our national expert on methane regulations in the States, and who was a primary author on our leak detection and repair action template. I believe she's on the call, and if she could say a few words about what we suggested and how it might work in Louisiana, that would be fantastic.
Sure thing. Hi, Adam. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here today. It's very exciting what Louisiana is considering undertaking. Happy to be a part and help in any way that I can. So addressing and reducing fugitive methane emissions from oil and gas sources is one of the most cost-effective ways to reduce methane. There are a number of examples, as we put in the document, that Louisiana could look to where other jurisdictions, including numerous states that have a lot of oil and gas production, like Colorado, like Wyoming, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, for example, as well as EPA regulations, Bureau of Land Management regulations, and then other jurisdictions outside the US, including the federal government of Canada, the major oil and gas producing provinces of Saskatchewan, British Columbia, and Alberta, and also the country of Mexico. So those are all examples of where other jurisdictions have imposed comprehensive, cost-effective regulations that reduce methane and other hydrocarbons from both new sources, so those sources constructed after the date of the regulations, as well as existing sources. And these regulations, by and large, all include in one form some kind of leak detection and repair program. That is essentially a requirement that operators go out on some kind of frequency. What we would recommend at EDF would be at least a quarterly monitoring frequency, or installing continuous methane or continuous hydrocarbon monitors to check for leaks. And then the regulations would require that the operators fix the leaks within a specified time frame. In some instances, it's as quickly as 5 days. Some regulations require quicker repairs depending on the size of the leak. And then accompany that requirement with detailed record keeping and reporting, so that A, the regulator is certain that the operator has in fact done their inspections and has fixed their fugitive emission leaks, and B, so that the operator and the industry actually can learn as they go about what specific types of equipment and components are most prone to leak and leak recurringly, which many of them do, and also how quickly it's possible to repair those leaks. So that's sort of a high level overview. And we think this would be something that would really, you could gain sort of immediate benefits in Louisiana. I guess one thing that's important to note is that in addition to reducing methane emissions, anytime an operator goes out and reduces a leak of natural gas, they're also reducing emissions of ozone precursor emissions, volatile organic compounds, as well as hazardous air pollutants like benzene. So all of those compounds are included in natural gas. Natural gas is primarily methane, but there's also some degree of VOCs and HAPs in the gas stream, depending on the specific gas composition of the leak. And so there's health benefits, public health benefits, benefits to persons that are living nearby, benefits to disproportionately impacted communities that also live by oil and gas facilities, as well as clear climate benefits. And because in many instances, the operators are capturing a product that they sell, i.e. natural gas, the overall implementing a leak detection and repair program is not just cost effective from a traditional regulatory standpoint when one compares the emission benefits to the compliance costs for the regulated industry, but it's also actually beneficial from an economic standpoint for the operators themselves, because they're capturing more product that they can then sell, send down the pipe, or they can use on site to power other equipment. And so in many instances, natural gas producing companies have implemented their own leak detection and repair programs even prior to being required to do so by regulators, because they see this as a benefit, both from an economic standpoint, a safety standpoint. Less natural gas at a site that's vented to the atmosphere makes for a safer work environment. But also, as I mentioned, there's economic benefits for the operator as well.
Thanks,
That's my
Elizabeth.
high-level overview. Sure, happy to answer any
Great
questions.
overview. I'm curious from our operators, any comments on that action idea?
Hey, Lindsay, this is Lori LeBlanc. Can you hear me?
Hey, Lori.
Hey, I just want to make a comment on this because I know Lamoga submitted it. Nathan McBride in our office, I know, serves on the Manufacturing and Industry Committee, so we'll probably cover this there. But just a couple comments I want to make relative to our submittal, which was around that first bullet item about leveraging the technology. And we recognize that there's been a lot of advancements in technology, such as optical gas imaging and some others. So we really need to be considering how to best manage our leak detection programs to just make sure we're investing in the resources in this area that are going to bring about the greatest returns. And more specifically, we think they'd be wise for DEQ and EPA to update their LDAR regulations to encourage leveraging some of this new technology, specifically the optical gas imaging technology. The current regulations were written before the technology was as advanced and as widely available as it is. So compliance with the regulations would be a lot more streamlined and less, it's actually more labor intensive right now to be able to comply with those regulations, being that there's new technology out there. So it just make it more efficient. And then I also wanted to add that Lamoga is working with our members to develop a Louisiana-focused leak detection best management practices document that really just takes into consideration the unique aspects of Louisiana operations. So just wanted to share that with the group. Thank you.
Well, good morning, Lindsay. Good morning, all. Great to be back together with you. This is Tom. So I've been in a listening mode so far because I agree with everything that's been said and up until this very moment. So thank you very much for that interesting report. And Laurie, thanks for putting a specific Louisiana connection with it. So as far as, Lindsay, I'm responding now because you asked for comments from the operators. Well, I'm not an operator. I don't work for an operator, but I do work for a company that provides services to operators. So I'll venture into your space here with that question and provide maybe a response on the other part of this category, which is flaring. So again, everything that's been said about reduced fugitive emissions, I personally, and I believe my corporation, in fact, my industry would support. Flaring, there's nothing on the slide about flaring. I remember in our previous meeting when we discussed flaring, there were some Texans on the call, and of course, flaring is a huge issue in the Permian, and certainly if this were a Texas issue, flaring would be rightly on the list. But I'm wondering, and again, focusing on our remit upstream, is flaring an issue in Louisiana? My sense is that, you know, every molecule of gas that comes out of the reservoir gets into a pipeline immediately and goes to market. I know there is some necessary flaring during the drilling and testing of the well process, but, you know, when the industry flares in Louisiana, as the previous speaker mentioned, that's revenue that's not being earned by the operator. So to bring up the first challenge again, because I've essentially agreed with everything said so far, should we be utilizing our committee's very focused and limited opportunities to make a difference in the overall initiative on flaring? I'll stop there and welcome any comments or challenges.
Hey, Tom, this is Lori LeBlanc. So I've consulted with Nathan on this. As you all know, he's our expert here on this. And he did make the comment to me that unlike Texas, Louisiana E&P involves little flaring. And our members are committed to eliminating flaring as much as practical. But I don't have any technical specifics to share, but he did share that tidbit with me, and happy to follow up on some of those details, but I just wanted to offer that up, make that comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom and Lori, for raising that. That was another question that I had here on just how do we improve on existing regulations of venting and flaring. So I know routine venting is generally prohibited, but wasn't as certain with flaring. And this might be a question for Brent more than you, Jason, I'm not sure. But I know that DNR, they don't flare. They don't encourage flaring on a regular basis, except when there is prior approval. But I'm not sure what that looks like or how often the approvals are given or what that process looks like. Jason, I'm not sure if you have better insight into that.
Lindsay, what I'd like to do with that one is just maybe hold that thought, and when Brent can come back on, that's definitely in his wheelhouse. So he can expound upon it. But yeah, if we could just make a note that he could touch on it next time when he's available, that would be fantastic.
That sounds great, Jason. We can hold that thought. And Tom and Lori, I can follow up with you guys as well on that.
And hey, this is Adam. I wanted to add one thing on that, which is that I couldn't tell you that much about flaring in Louisiana in particular, but New Mexico just adopted no routine venting and flaring, along with a 98% flaring efficiency requirement. So if it's determined that, you know, flaring is an issue and you're looking for something to do about it, that framework, no routine venting and flaring and 98% flaring efficiency would be a good place to start.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Adam. But New Mexico is similar to West Texas, and part of the Permian does extend into New Mexico. So they're dealing with what is a true global issue in flaring out there, as opposed to what we're doing here. And you know, venting and flaring, it flows together. It rolls off the tongue very easily. But if we don't have a problem, I would say we're more credible by not even including it in our recommendations. And again, I'm not qualified to say if we have a problem or not, but I think it is worth getting a few folks that are more knowledgeable than maybe those of us on this call to weigh in on whether flaring is a problem, again, in the upstream sector of oil and gas in Louisiana. Manufacturing, absolutely, must be there. But upstream, I would challenge our committee to determine whether or not we should include flaring in our discussions going forward, because as many of us have discussed, it's counter to the entire enterprise of exploration production to flare your marketable product.
This is Al Collins. I just want to add one quick thing. From what I understand, and we have an internal goal, Oxy, about eliminating flaring, routine flaring by a certain date. The issue in the Permian is more about infrastructure availability than it is anything else. And I'm not sure that is the capacity and the infrastructure in Louisiana is the issue, but I can certainly ask. We don't operate upstream in Louisiana, but I can ask the experts at Oxy to get some clarification on that. But I'll just offer that.
Well, you're exactly right on the Permian, and infrastructure is being built as we speak. So eventually the flaring issue in the Permian will be similar to that, like it is in Louisiana, in that every molecule of gas immediately goes through the processing equipment into a pipeline, eventually to the ultimate consumer. But they're not there yet. We're there. We're there in Louisiana.
This is Glenn Lyons with ExxonMobil. Just one more comment on it. I mean, I'm not an expert on the topic either, so I don't have an answer for you. But I do know, I mean, you're typically going to see bigger flaring problems where you have associated gas production with oil production. And I think that most production in Louisiana is gas and not oil. So that might help just avoid the problem. But again, I'm not an expert on the topic.
Hey, Lindsay, this is Lori. I'm happy to work with Nathan and our members to see what other follow-up information we can provide on that.
That would be great. That'd be great. And as Jason mentioned, Jason and I can check in with Brent and begin to think about that in the context of Louisiana, and then check in with Al, Tom, Glenn, and Lori on those specific measures that you guys mentioned. It's really great to hear, Al, that you guys have a goal of eliminating routine flaring entirely. It's great.
Yeah, a lot of companies do.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and then one final comment for me in this category on back to the one that I think we all agree on, including fugitive emissions. And then there was some discussion by Laurie about technology. So this is the perfect use of drones with sensoring. And I didn't hear the word drone mentioned. If it was mentioned, I apologize for not hearing it. But I think our response should certainly include utilization of cutting-edge drone technology to work on the reduce fugitive emissions objective. It literally is a game changer when you think about some of the remote areas where the exploration production happens.
Tom, that was the last question I had on this slide too, probably for Elizabeth and Lori, maybe better for Nathan McBride. Is the technology there and we need to incentivize use of the appropriate technology, or where's the barrier, where are the gaps in reaching that?
Lindsay, I'm happy to provide what I know, and others may know more. So there definitely are some new technologies that can be used to monitor for methane emissions, as well as other hydrocarbons, either total hydrocarbons or volatile organic compounds. Some of these monitor continuously. Some of them monitor at a high frequency. So for example, they take measurements maybe once every 15 minutes, for example. In Colorado, the Colorado Air Quality Control Commission adopted a rule last December that actually requires operators who are constructing new well production facilities or adding a new well to an existing production facility to install some kind of ambient air quality monitoring system that could include, for example, some of these new sensors that detect methane that can be placed around basically the perimeter of a well pad. So those types of systems need to be constructed by the operator during the entire pre-production phase of a well site, as well as for the first 6 months of production. And the rules are specifically broad with respect to the type of systems that can be deployed in order to allow operators flexibility to determine the most appropriate technology for the particular well site, taking into consideration if there's nearby homes or other people nearby, or sort of regional air quality issues that the operator might want to monitor, or the state might want the operator to monitor, in addition to monitoring for methane. So that's one example that's really sort of allowing and incenting for the growth that we're seeing right now in the kind of hydrocarbon methane sensor technology world. And then a number of jurisdictions allow operators to submit a plan to utilize some kind of alternate detection, leak detection system, other than optical gas imaging, which we heard a little bit about earlier, or method 21, which is another EPA approved method to detect emissions from leaks. And so EPA's rules, for example, allow operators to apply to EPA to utilize some kind of alternative technology that could include, for example, some kind of remote sensing or continuous methane monitor. The state of Colorado allows that as well. The New Mexico Environment Department just proposed a rule that would allow for that, and their Oil Conservation Commission rule that Adam mentioned previously that bans routine flaring and venting and establishes a 98% capture goal for all venting and flaring from oil and gas wells, also allows operators to use some kind of aerial survey as one way to reduce their emissions. So there's a number of regulatory examples that allow, and I would say incent, the use of these emerging leak detection technologies. And it's definitely an exciting space, and there's a lot going on in it. And drones would be one of the sort of options, although I'm not familiar with the efficacy and how widely used they are, but I do know that some operators are using them and are investigating further use of them as well.
Hey, this is Lori. I will just add to that and reiterate what I said earlier. I'm not an expert on leak detection technology, but as we said earlier, as technology becomes more readily available, it would just be very helpful if we could look at the regulations and allow for more regulatory flexibility that would free up some of the companies to be able to shift from regulatory spending in order to, they have to ask or to be able to use this alternative technology and be able to use those resources on the new technology that obviously as new technology comes available, it's expensive. So I think the regulatory issues are something we really need to consider and take into consideration as part of the solutions that we're looking at.
Thanks, Lori and Elizabeth. Are there any other comments on this slide? We have a lot of great next steps and case studies to look into.
Hey, can I, Glenn Lyons again, can I add one more thing, which is just that, that ExxonMobil, several of the other oil and gas companies are working through various organizations, including like the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, to investigate things, how do we adopt technology? And so I would just encourage y'all to look at such organizations, OGCI being the one that comes to mind first.
Thanks, Glenn. And please send any information or other studies that you see being done in that space to us.
Oh, okay, will do.
Yeah, that sounds great. So we'll keep moving on to the next slide. I'm glad we got to park some on the legacy infrastructure and on fugitive emissions, since that's a big focus in the up and midstream. Moving forward to thinking about reduced carbon intensity and footprint of I specify the up and midstream here because a few of these actions, as I mentioned the first time, are more focused on the downstream manufacturing and facility side, but just wanted to think through where it's possible to further reduce carbon intensity and footprints of up and midstream operations if electrification is possible in any of these processes, either upstream or in the midstream storage and transportation. If you guys had any thoughts on that, or also on the balance of permitting streamlining of these decarbonization projects. What could that look like? What could that assist for you guys from the operational perspective? Any initial thoughts on these or on the actions presented here?
This is Al Collins with Oxy again. I'm a little bit concerned about things like the myth of carbon capture. Is it helpful to have that, or there are all sorts of things that can be done to lower the carbon intensity and greenhouse gas footprint of upstream. Anything that reduces methane emissions, green completions, all that kind of stuff. But also there's a pretty big opportunity through things like direct air capture to actually to develop negative emissions around this that can be used to further lower the greenhouse gas intensity. So in fact, there's been studies done that show that you can actually store more CO2 in producing oil than the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions associated with that oil. So I think by calling into question the technology and the application to upstream at this point is something that I would say Oxy is not comfortable with, and I don't think we can talk about the ways the technology could be applied and whether that's appropriate, but the veracity of the technology I don't think is fair, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I think there are a couple of things here that are incredibly biased. Obviously, that would be the myth of carbon capture. It's not a myth. I think we could debate how effective it is, but it is real. It's not a myth. And then, the fourth bullet, eliminate fossil fuels. So there's your headliner. And then I see, to the extent practically possible. So that perhaps is designed to mitigate the fourth bullet, but eliminate fossil fuels. Well, we are the mining and oil and gas committee. I can't support 4 or 5 with the reference to the myth of carbon capture. I don't think they should have made it on the slide. That's my view.
Tom and Al, I'm glad that you guys brought up that point, and I'll let Jason, as chair of the committee, speak to this more. But we wanted to get in front of you guys all of the actions that were relevant to this sector. It's not that we're supporting or recommending that these move forward yet. Those are decisions the task force will make as we move into the summertime and then into the fall as well. But really just, as we talked about in the March meeting, throwing everything against the wall and really thinking through the issues and concerns with these. So there's no need to formally adopt or approve any of these actions, really just opening it to discussion. Jason, if you have any additional comments.
Sure. Thanks, Lindsay, and Tom and others. Thanks so much for the comments. I think that we at DNR right now are moving forward with a comprehensive energy plan for the state, which I think that kind of hits on some of the points where we want to evaluate any and all available technologies in addition to looking at all the fuel sources that we're currently using in Louisiana. I think that at the end of the day, it's in our best interest to look at these things holistically, to look at how can we make those technologies most efficient? How can we reduce the greenhouse gases associated with those technologies in the most efficient manner? So I think that that's where the energy plan and some of these other things that we're looking at can really start to flush out what we need to look at specifically with each one of these technologies. So I think that for us, we've identified some early mover technologies. Obviously, CCUS is a big part of that picture. When we talk about permit streamlining, I saw a comment from several folks about what we can do on the federal side to try to expedite permits. As one of the comments was also related to whether or not the state was going to try to get a regulatory primacy for carbon sequestration. So that process is already underway. I think that there's a lot of overlap with some of the other committees on CCUS and some of the other things that we're discussing, but the state and DNR is moving forward with trying to get primacy for Class 6 sequestration. We have been working over the last 3 years with EPA and our other federal partners to look at any and all available things that we can do to try to expedite that, in addition to forming an ad hoc committee that's specifically studying regulatory issues and reaching out to public specifically on those issues. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done, but at the end of the day, it's imperative that we look at all of our fuel sources and try to tackle the monumental task of trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the state. And I think that we're going to have to employ an all hands on deck when we look at these things. I think that each thing that we're evaluating has a place, and I think that we need to look at them and try to work together to come up with the best solutions.
Great points to raise, Jason. And just for everyone's awareness, we in the governor's office are also working with Jason and coordinating our climate plan that we're working through with the comprehensive energy plans. We're really understanding and working to identify those gaps and potential opportunities. Dr. Hughes, I see your hand.
So I got to leave here in a little bit. So I've got another meeting, and I wanted to, because this is about the third time I've seen this on here about the big data, and I won't jump on my typical one, which is CCUS, but I will at least talk a little bit about big data. I think that's a really a great opportunity that I brought up a number of meetings ago, but didn't seem to have any sort of footprint that took hold. So that requires a fair amount of openness in data reporting and data availability for the tools to go after. And I think it has tremendous opportunities in, as it's talked about here, the different fluxes that could go on, as well as some of the ideas back in the legacy infrastructure where you could be looking at the reticence or the capabilities of different equipment pieces or the structures that people could be going after. I'd really like to see something going there. And then I didn't bring it up at the time, and I probably should have, but I didn't. I'd like to go back, I guess, to a little bit of what Adam brought out. We talked about technology in the previous set of slides and how important that is for the venting and flaring or for the methane emissions. But if we didn't apply the same idea to flare stacks or to, I mean, this is an opportunity for us to make things better in our state. And I think we ought to pose those things, even if we're not sure that they are a problem currently, because, you know, the next big gas production or the next big oil field may come calling, and we'd want the requirements or the regulations to be in place to allow us to make sure that we're operating both as efficiently and as green as we can. And with that, like I said, I'm going to have to probably step out. Jason, I do have a couple things for you and Brent again, so I'll try to do those by email.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hughes.
Hey, Lindsay, this is Lori again.
Hey, Lori.
Before we move off this slide, I did want to also make the comment relative to bullets number 4 and 5, and I appreciate Jason's comments around the state is developing a comprehensive energy plan. So I think we all need to recognize that obviously Louisiana is an energy state. The oil and natural gas industry has a $70 billion impact on this state. It employs about 250,000 jobs. I don't think I'm telling all of you anything you didn't already know. So the concept of eliminating fossil fuels as part of this effort, I don't think is something we should be considering. Also, as we talk about very often around all of the above conversation and making sure that throughout this energy transition that oil and natural gas is part of that big picture. So anticipate that number 4 wouldn't be something that we want to embrace and include in a comprehensive state energy plan. And then of course on bullet number 5, I agree with the previous members of this committee regarding the myth of carbon capture. We recognize that carbon capture is real. It has great potential for reducing emissions in our energy state. It's going to be a great new technology for us and even create jobs. And Louisiana is in a great position for CCUS. So just want to support what the others said in terms of really don't think that items, points number 4 and 5 should be part of this plan going forward. Thank you.
Thanks for your comments, Lori, and for Dr. Hughes as well. Just to provide a little bit more context on those, the number 4 and 5, and then we can move on to the next slide in the interest of time. But for that 4th one on eliminating fossil fuels, just reading back through the proposal again, it's recommending that we encourage wind turbines and solar panels to reduce carbon dioxide because it can also reduce fossil fuel, air pollution, mining, pipeline, refinery, gas station, tankers, in lieu of CCS. So they are pushing the wind and the solar components, just to provide context there. And then on that second one on carbon-free Louisiana, and this might go well in the CCUS conversation, but it's recommending to set core requirements for transparency, equity, and public safety in consideration and construction of any new carbon capture, utilization, or sequestration activities, including implementation of disclosure processes and oversight requirements. So a few components that dive into that strategy that we had talked through in the March meeting on the environmental integrity and the equity components of CCUS. So we can revisit or think through that one as we move forward there.
Hey, Lindsay, thank you for explaining that. I think if they were stated that way, I'd feel a lot more comfortable. Certainly wind and solar have a big part, a big role, and actually reducing upstream carbon intensity for oil and gas operations. A lot of companies are incorporating these renewable power sources in our operations. So I think saying it that way is certainly something I know that Oxy can agree with. I suspect most other people can too. Also, the way you described the carbon-free Louisiana statement, I think talking about the need for more transparency and more information around things like environmental justice and those types of issues are really important in helping the public accept and also promote carbon capture. So that is a really good way, I think, of stating it. But the myth of carbon capture really just rubs me the wrong way.
Thanks, Al, for those comments. I'm curious if you or maybe other members know, you mentioned on the opportunities to transform upstream power sources to renewables. Are there any specific opportunities that come to mind? I know we might not be the most technical insights on that.
Do you mean, for a long time, the industry, the upstream industry, has been electrifying fields. And there was a really practical reason or rationale for doing that. If you used electricity, then you didn't have to get a Title V permit. And there was a lot of concerns about emissions around these operations from things like diesel generators, et cetera. So there's been a big wave of the operators electrifying their operations, and especially in the Permian and Colorado, places that I can talk about, places that Oxy operates. So it's only a natural step out that companies would look at. If you're going to electrify, or you're already electrified, how could you use less carbon intensive electricity like wind and solar to help those operations? And not to put in a plug for Oxy, but Oxy's invested in a company called Net Power, which uses natural gas and has zero emissions, because the carbon is the CO2 emissions are captured and then geologically sequestered. So that is another way of reducing your carbon intensity. And we've begun to use the terminology emissions-free power versus renewable power, because there may be an opportunity for small nuclear operations to help power these too. I don't know of any company doing that yet, but there's a lot of talk about how to integrate nuclear and reducing carbon intensity. So Oxy has deployed a very large solar array called Goldsmith in the Permian, which we're using 100% of that power internally. We're certainly not unique in doing that. A lot of companies have. So integrating wind, solar, hopefully soon Net Power in these operations is practice now. So I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I'd love to connect offline and hear more about the work that you guys have done in those case studies.
Hey, Lindsay, just a little more follow-up on that. So ExxonMobil and I know Oxy as well are both members of a group called Louisiana Energy User Group, and they're participating in the Power Committee. And I do believe that they have put in some action proposals kind of relating to behind the meter renewables. And that would apply to the upstream as well as to industry, manufacturing, and elsewhere.
That's great, Flynn. Thanks. It gets back to the point that Jason made earlier, that these committees and these sectors are so interconnected. You're right. It's really important to work with the power group on that. Okay. Any last comments on this strategy? That sets us up well for a discussion on the different market mechanisms and financial incentives for decarbonization. So as we're looking towards these technologies, and as we've talked about today with increasing monitoring and utilizing federal opportunities and incentives, what are some of these financial incentives and different market mechanisms that might be most applicable and helpful in the decarbonization of the up and midstream? Jason, I saw you came off mute, and Glenn, I'd love to hear more about your economy-wide mechanism.
Sure. So I think just an introduction that I think would help to provide a little bit of color to the discussion is when we first started looking at greenhouse gas reduction, potentially through CCUS and also utilization and carbon intensity, one of the first questions that folks would ask was whether or not the state would put an incentive program or do some type of cap and trade. And at the time, we recognized that there may have been, just with the state's economy and the existing things that were going on, we knew that trying to couple a state incentive with some of the existing federal incentives that were out there would probably be a bit of a lift, just with the current status of the legislator, and I think it would continue to be today. So DNR specifically focused on trying to look at regulatory efficiencies in terms of trying to set up just a very efficient process for folks to work with EPA and to work with our Department of Conservation if they did want to pursue those types of projects. So over the last several years, not to get too much into the details on what's related to primacy and underground injection and control, Adam could do a seminar on this. I know we've sat in a lot of meetings on it, but so basically it's a very labor intensive. The modeling is very extensive anytime you're doing any type of capture or sequestration. And the states that have gotten regulatory primacy, that was almost a 6-year process, and in some cases a 6.5-year process. So to get and qualify for the federal incentives before the changes were made in December to extend 45Q, we knew that time was of the essence. So we have focused specifically on trying to look at, what can we do to support EPA from an administration standpoint, whether that's through federal appropriations, and how can we leverage our staff in conservation who's very familiar with the geology and the other components of injection to try to help facilitate that process. So I think that that's been where our focus has been, is specifically on the regulatory efficiency. I do think that these items that were brought up are very good, just because I think that there's some things that we can look at in terms of when we start to go through projects, there will be things that I think that the state can do to further incentivize and to further look at how we bring these projects to Louisiana. So I think that this is it's a good intro into what we're doing. I think that right now we're kind of just hoping to see 45Q and get projects through the door, see how those go. And I think that the policy things that will come out of that and by doing projects will help to inform us on this next wave of what type of recommendations that we can make. But I think that the comments that were made and read through were very well received. And I'm hoping that folks continue to look for ideas on how we can continue to just incentivize and work towards the goal of reducing emissions and really looking at carbon in the long term.
Okay, should I kind of speak to our action proposal now, Lindsay?
That'd be great. Thanks, Jason, for that table setting on this.
Okay, so let me first just point out, so the first 3 items on your list, so clearly the third one is ours. The second one, Takesha, is with the Louisiana Chemical Association. We are a member of that organization, and we support that action proposal. I also read through the first, the cap and trade one as well. I think it's very largely similar to all 3 of these. You could pick any one of them, and you wouldn't be missing too much, overlooking the others. So let me start with just a quick preface, which is that we've been a long time proponent of a national carbon price. We still believe there should be a national carbon price. We would like to see Louisiana policymakers support a national carbon price, and that's our first choice. If you're not going to, if that's, let me put it this way, if the state is going to pursue state-specific policies, however, a state-only carbon price might be a more efficient way to get at some of the same issues. It would allow you to avoid a potential patchwork quilt of various policies. And let me say just on that, since earlier we were talking about kind of the upstream emissions, that there are areas that we would see as being sort of needing to be held separately. Like we agree, upstream emissions, that a carbon price is not the way to get at that. Regulation is the way to get at that. So we're very supportive of most of what the conversation covered earlier. We think through a patchwork kind of approach to carbon policy is you end up, in effect, you're creating a carbon price, but it's not a transparent carbon price. And that's part of the inefficiency. Consumers don't have a price signal that they can react on. And that's part of what, for the most effective policy, you need consumers to see it as well. They've got to know and make the right decisions themselves as far as their carbon emissions go. Because that'll ultimately drive a lot of what other industry players are doing as well. There probably, well, a handful of points, and I think I brought most of these up on an earlier call as kind of what we think are kind of the key elements of a good carbon pricing policy. One is it's kind of uniform throughout the economy as best as possible. It's predictable, so that if you're part of the reason you would use a carbon price is you're trying to incentivize investments in new technologies. And if that price is not predictable, you're going to send the wrong signal in terms of those investments. You want to have minimize the complexity, make it a relatively low administrative burden. Transparency is important, so everybody understands how is the number being derived, if it's changing in the future, how are we thinking about that. It's got to be at the same time flexible to changes in technology, changes in climate science. If we discover that the price needs to go higher faster, or it can go a little slower because of advances in the science. I mean, I think that all makes good sense too. You would want to sunset any state-only policy when there is federal action as well, to avoid duplication, also avoid the state kind of acting independently. I mean, the broader a geography that a carbon price is covering, the more efficient it's going to be, the greater the opportunities will be to find the most efficient place to start with the emissions reductions. You want to avoid overlap with other policies. To the extent that there are opportunities to draw linkages, I point to like the RGGI program in the Northeast, a cap and trade system that goes beyond states. So to the extent that there's opportunities to do that, again, that just helps make the whole program much more efficient. You want to make sure that you're not just reducing emissions in the state of Louisiana only, and in fact to have emissions increase elsewhere. So if the end result is reduced industry in the state, but that industry effectively gets exported to other jurisdictions where the carbon policies are far more permissive, then at the end of the day, we don't gain, we actually lose in that scenario, and that's not good for anybody. And then the last point I'll just make is you got to be very mindful. I mean, this is, as the state heads down this path of trying to create carbon policy, without being in lockstep with the rest of the nation, there's a strong chance that the state is put at a competitive disadvantage economically. And so that needs to be weighed very heavily into any policy. So with that, I think I'm done. Thanks.
Thanks for that context, Glenn. It's a really comprehensive action and framework that you put together there. I'm curious if other members have comments or questions, ideas on that.
I'll make a quick comment, and this is Al Collin with Oxy. We are big fans of the low carbon fuel standard that California has. We think that's there are a lot of benefits to that program. We think certain clean energy standards can work. And I'll just make a bigger comment. We look at carbon pricing as kind of a bunch of different ways you can implement it: cap and trade, emission reduction requirements, low carbon fuel standard, clean energy standard. They're all ways of implementing or using a carbon price to develop programs to lower emissions. So our biggest kind of tenet with things like a carbon tax are any revenues that are raised, but not any revenues, but the majority of revenues raised should be put back into technologies that reduce carbon emissions and infrastructure to help implement that, or help deploy that. So that's kind of where we're coming from, but good list here, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. And if nobody has anything to say, I'll say one more thing. There's a lot of pressure among investors to also help reduce carbon intensity. And so the market mechanisms, one of them may be investor demands or preferences.
That's a great point to make. And to your point on the low carbon fuel standard and clean energy standards, those are actions that were raised by other groups, but are also really integrated into this, the financial incentive component. Lori, I saw that you had gone off mute. Did you have any comments?
Hey, yeah, Lindsay, I didn't know if you wanted me to provide any context around the greenhouse gas reduction property tax exemption.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, happy to do that. I know we submitted that here at Lamoga. So just to put that in context, we are recommending that Louisiana adopt an exemption from property tax for non-revenue generating capital investments that lead to a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. It is an exemption from property tax, so it would require a constitutional amendment, but we think that it would be a strong statement that the state of Louisiana is committed to partnering with companies and organizations who are willing to invest in our state, who are committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Like I said, it's from non-revenue generating equipment. I would require a constitutional amendment. Also want to point out that this is already, this would be coming from, obviously, I guess I want to point out that you're not removing, this would impact future revenue. Parishes are not currently getting this revenue, right? So it would be future revenue. So it wouldn't impact or have a fiscal impact on current revenues at the parish level. So I just want to point that out as well. That was it. Thank you.
Thanks, Lori. On the action that CF Industries put forward on corporate decarbonization tax incentives, that was also a component tied in there on exempting local property taxes for 10 years that would otherwise be assessed on decarbonization projects. Any other comments from members on the financial incentives and on these market mechanisms? And Glenn, our team will be in touch with you to think more through this carbon pricing consideration as we talk with the manufacturing industry group. I know Takesha had a good system put forward as well, and we can think through the integration of those ideas.
Happy to help.
Okay, great. In the interest of time, I'll move us along. So we're looking a little bit more forward, and we have just a few strategies left to think through. So this component of increasing deployment of carbon capture technology and infrastructure is also tied to the next strategy on transparency, feasibility, environmental integrity, and environmental justice of CCUS. So as we start to think through these actions, we can also bring those into the fold as well and have one conversation around both sets of those. Jason, I know that we talked previously about just setting up where you guys are in this process. So if you could tee us up on this discussion, that'd be great.
Sure. So I think we kind of teed up the regulatory comments on where we were in terms of primacy, but I want to touch just a little bit on some of the usage piece. We often talk about CCS versus CCUS, and I think that the utilization piece, that a lot of these comments touch on how we can look at using, not only trying to look for ways for doing geological sequestration of CO2, but also, potentially looking at using this as a feedstock for making other, either low carbon intensity fuels or low carbon intensity products. So I think that when we look at the potential on the ammonia side and potentially on hydrogen and some of these other things, all these things look at potentially just advancing the sector to where working with existing industries and looking for ways to utilize those flow streams of CO2. So I think that for us, looking through these ideas, it's exciting just because I think that Louisiana has so much expertise on manufacturing right now that if we can look at turning this into an industry for marketing those products there, as we're starting to see now, there are many incentives across the globe for low carbon intensity products, both for concrete, steel, fuels, biofuels. Al Collins mentioned the low carbon fuel standard in California. So I think that all of these comments are directly in line on things that we can do to try to streamline the process and potentially look for adoption of using some of the existing fuel sources that we have to make those products. So I think that it's an exciting space and time for us. I think that there's a tremendous support at the federal level now to move some of these programs forward, in addition to having dollars available for companies who want to do these types of projects. So we're going to continue to work with our federal partners and with DOE. We've already had initial conversations with them on looking at innovative projects and ways that we can do this. So again, just happy to see these comments and look forward to further discussion.
Thanks, Jason, for teeing that up. I'm curious for members, I know this was a big focus of the March meeting, what comments there are on the actions received here, on anything that sticks out to you or highlights to you as an important step here, building on what Jason said.
Hi, Lindsay. This is Adam. I was wondering whether the CCS action template that we submitted is covered on this slide or a later slide.
Yeah, Adam, that one is on this next slide and maybe we can integrate these two conversations on the transparency, feasibility, and then environmental integrity and justice components. Adam, would you mind speaking to that? I know Scott couldn't make it today.
Sure. And so, so the idea of this template is we've been talking about the importance of recognizing that overburdened communities are concerned about CCS for a lot of reasons, and that I know the state has committed to working with frontline communities and environmental justice groups to think through these issues. And in particular, I understand that DNR, in its pursuit of primacy, of Class 6 primacy, is thinking very hard about how to incorporate environmental justice considerations into that program, and so, which is good. But thinking, thinking broadly about carbon capture and sequestration, these projects involve, capture equipment at facilities and ensuring there's sufficient power available for that extra equipment. Sometimes there's facility enlargement. There's, new or expanded pipelines, and that's all in addition to the sequestration sites themselves. And so the primacy and DNR's oversight of CCS is focused on the sequestration sites, but the EJ implications exist for the entire supply chain of a CCS project, from source to transport to sink. And so this action template is a proposal for the various agencies in Louisiana that would touch on a CCS project throughout its lifetime, coordinate their approach to EJ on this issue so that there's a gap. It would be a shame if DNR adopts a policy on environmental justice for these projects is not followed through in the rest of the supply chain. And this is something that could be coordinated at the governor's office level, I'd imagine.
And Adam, I'll just say thank you for those comments. I think that what you've seen on the breakout committee, that the ad hoc committee that we've been working through that, I think that Steve Lee and his team have heard those comments loud and clear. They're working through specifically with EPA on the permitting process to work through and try to make sure that they're looking at the permitting process holistically. And I think that the conversations with EPA have been very fruitful. So appreciate the comments, and I know Steve appreciates it. So look forward to working through those with you guys.
That's great. And I know that EPA is front loading EJ and everything that it's thinking about. So it's good that you are at the forefront.
A really great idea that you guys raised, Adam, around looking at that whole life cycle from source to transport. And some great points that you just raised on ensuring that it's addressed at the federal and the state level and all of the components that are involved. And as you mentioned, we've seen a lot of movement in the EPA to prioritize environmental justice and equity. So I see a lot of potential on that scale too. An action more related to the environmental integrity, Dr. Zaydouni, who's a member of our science advisory group, put forward this action that raised CCUS deployment as critical, but just raised some concerns on leakage pathways for injected CO2 from excessive well drilling and reservoir compartmentalization were the two components that he had raised. And I was curious from you guys if that is a shared concern. He proposes a project to hone in on and prevent leak detection through faults in wells by identifying CO2 evolution and the location and status of reservoir boundaries. So I thought that was an interesting idea to raise. I'm not as engaged on that technological of a scale with CCUS, but really liked the action that he raised there.
Well, this is Adam, and I'll just say that monitoring to ensure no CO2 leakage from these projects will be essential both for the effectiveness of the projects in terms of reducing climate change, but also engendering public trust that the operators know what they're doing and are keeping CO2 where it's supposed to go, and that the regulators are on top of that and working together to make sure CO2 stays where it's in place. And there's a little bit of overlap between the orphan well conversation too, because orphan wells are a potential conduit for CO2 migration. If you have one of these in a storage field and it's not properly plugged, and it could allow CO2 migration. So there's synergies in many of these ideas. But overall, monitoring is good, and science to better understand the sequestration sites in Louisiana is also good. And there's DOE funding for that sort of thing too.
I mean, Adam makes a great point. Orphan wells would likely disqualify an area for sequestration. So take care of orphan wells, you provide potential opportunity for sequestration, and then the management of such sequestration. Nice connect, Adam.
Yeah, that's a national conversation too. This is a problem all over the place.
Al, did you have any additional comments on that?
Yeah, I did. I can't stress the importance of choosing the right storage site, be it a former oil and gas reservoir or a operating oil and gas reservoir or a saline aquifer or basalt site, to make sure that you identify all the penetrations, which means all the wells or other things that have been drilled into the storage site, So absolutely under doing a survey of orphan wells and making sure that every well that has been closed is properly abandoned and plugged, which is another issue. I mean, these are just kind of the minimum requirements that you must do in order to make sure that your storage operation is going to have integrity. So I think Oxy believes that EPA has a very good approach to verifying storage under their RR program. Certainly not the only one. ISO came out with another standard for verifying storage in conjunction with the OR recently too. But yes, it's an important issue, but it's one that should be addressed head on and shouldn't be, there should be no confusion by the public that sites that are not good, that have transmissive faults and fractures, I mean, it could go on and on, are going to be used to quote store CO2 when they're not well, when they're not good sites. I'll also say that they're kind of different risk associated with different sites that ought to be concerned or ought to be of concern. With a former oil and gas reservoir or an operating oil and gas reservoir, you're going to be much more concerned about the penetrations that have been in that reservoir, like I mentioned earlier. For things like saline aquifers, where probably it's never been drilled into, you're not going to be as concerned, but you're going to be more concerned about overpressurization. In both situations, you want to make sure you have a good mechanical integrity program, a good well integrity program in place, because that's going to probably be your most likely source of leaks. So while I agree with this, I think it's important that we acknowledge that this be a minimum for CCUS, the storage operations. The other thing I wanted to say is there's been some recent evaluations of the benefits of carbon capture on certain industrial emissions and how or I should say the co-benefits beyond just CO2 capture. So things like being able to reduce particulate matter, sulfur dioxides, there's an opportunity to improve the more air toxics and criteria pollutants that are co-benefits to putting carbon capture on certain industrial emissions. So that's an upside EJ component of this that I think as we get more research and we do more studies, that opportunity will be something that the EJ community will view as a benefit. Thank you.
Thanks for raising those ideas, Al. I'd love to learn more about that study that you referenced on the other co-benefits of CCUS, if you wouldn't mind sending that.
Yeah, the Boundary Dam project in Canada did a great analysis of the reductions in SOx and PM, and I think significant NOx too. And when I was thinking about industrialized areas that maybe have non-attainment problems for criteria pollutants, carbon capture may be a way of helping those areas still remain, kind of healthy from jobs as well as healthy from air quality. But I'm glad to share that with you.
These are some great additional lenses to think through this particular strategy around CCUS. Any other ideas on what we're missing here or what we can expand on?
Well, this is Adam, and I just wanted to pile on to what I was saying about this concept of simultaneously reducing traditional pollutants while reducing CO2. That is something of a holy grail in the carbon capture and sequestration universe, and would take care of a lot of problems for a lot of people at once. And there is certainly possibility to do pilot work on that in Louisiana. And that would be, I think, a nice thing to pursue.
So Adam and Al, does that depend on how the CCUS system or well is developed? Depending on if it can also sequester particulate matter. Do we know that, or are we still, is that still in research?
Lindsay, I'm not sure I understood your question.
I guess I'm trying to understand the potential of reducing particulate matter. Is that based on the particular facility, or?
Yes, it's based on you know, what's in the emissions from the facility where you're doing carbon capture. And the idea is that the actual technology that you're using to remove the carbon won't work if you've got these other pollutants in the stream. So you have to either remove them ahead of time, or you have to use technology that can remove several things at once. But the thing that struck me with Boundary Dam is they had such reduction in the criteria pollutants that, you know, they could actually, if were they in the US, they could have sold those to other facilities, and it would be another revenue stream.
Thanks, Al, for that context. And members, in the interest of time, I'll move us on to our last discussion point. This might be a conversation better suited for our manufacturing and industry group, since these are a few members on them, but I just wanted to put in front of you guys the different actions that were proposed on green hydrogen. And I understand that the challenge now is that the electrolyzers for green hydrogen are in short supply, and it's a very expensive process. So I was curious from you guys if there are opportunities for just incentivizing further development. I know this is an area of future development, and where we can put some technology and research. If you guys had any additional comments to raise or additional ideas around green or blue hydrogen. And other alternative fuels as well. There was an idea put forward around renewable natural gas too.
Yeah, and there's technology to convert CO2 into jet fuel too. Few different ways of doing that. I don't. Is steam methane reforming to make hydrogen? Is that the? Oh, that's the third one. Forgive me. I guess it's the third one. Maybe not.
I think that is a component of the third one.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Steam methane reforming of natural gas to make hydrogen. I think I said methane. Sorry about that.
That's quite all right if there are no further ideas or comments. I know we've gone through a lot of actions today, and appreciate you guys hanging with us through all 31 of them. This has been a really helpful conversation on my side, at least. I hope for you guys too.
Well, Lindsay.
Yeah, Tom, if you have any thoughts.
So this is, I'm not advocating that we include it, but it's been something I've been thinking about in several of our meetings when we get to this point. The overall category would be wetlands restoration, and I trust that there's another committee working on that, and then The reason I'm even mentioning it is that so much of the wetlands restoration activities are funded by the oil and gas sector, either through Go Mesa funds from production or Restore Act funds from the Macondo incident. So that's why I even mention it. But incredible amount of literature being released even as we speak about the benefits of wetlands in carbon reduction. So if another group is covering this, I'm very happy with that. But given the oil and gas, at least the oil and gas sector's funding and in some cases actual doing wetlands restoration work, is that something we should put here? So I'll stop there and welcome responses.
Tom, I'm so glad that you bring that up. We do have an agriculture, forestry, conservation, and waste committee that we funneled some of those wetland restoration actions towards, but had really wonderful ideas around. One of them was really focusing on our ability to monitor, understand emission reduction potential of wetlands in our carbon sinks in Louisiana so that we can utilize those for offset opportunities and offset markets. And we are working on, separate from this process, with the Water Institute, we're working on quantifying the emission reduction potential of our wetlands. So better understanding the linkage between our coastal restoration program and our climate mitigation program as well, to understand that potential. So we're trying to keep our sights set on that.
Christy, I would value your comments on this question.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, I actually just learned a lot from what Lindsay was saying, but I think when we first started this committee, one of the potential areas was in natural sequestration. And so, but we weren't able to get to that in our long list of items, which we just covered today. And so Lindsay connected me with the committee she mentioned around agriculture. And they are looking at some activities that connect into some of the state's coastal restoration activities. So I think from my perspective, it appears to be somewhat of a dotted line, but connected nonetheless.
Well, thank you both. And with that, I'll withdraw even the question. But I guess if I understand this process, as we move towards recommendations, committees will be linked. So as Christy said, maybe let the dotted line turn into a dash line or perhaps even a solid line linking our committee to the wetlands restoration activity and the carbon sequestration benefits from that.
Certainly, Tom, that's a great connection to make there. And if you have any specific ideas or actions that you would like to see move forward in that space, or just have your eye on in that space, I can help you look through and connect on those offline if that's helpful.
I mean, what initially comes to mind is the work being done at Port Fourchon, which is primarily a port for the deepwater oil and gas business. And as they go about their port maintenance and their plans to deepen the channels in the port, they're really doing some good things about the beneficial use of the, doing air quotes here, spoils from those maintenance dredging operations and future deepening operations. I'll send you something on that. I mean, that's a bit of a direct linkage there, but that also is a bit of a one-off. I think the bigger issue is the funding from our sector to enable almost all of the work of CTRA.
Yes, absolutely, Tom, that'd be great. Members, are there any final comments on the actions that we've reviewed or strategies or just the sector more broadly?
I've got a very brief question.
Yeah, Andy.
Okay, I put it in the chat too, but I was wondering if at what point we can review any public comments that are submitted about our action proposals. I think it would just be helpful to see any public feedback on anything that we drafted.
Andy, we'll move into a public comment period next in just a minute. If there is anyone watching online or through our webinar that has comments on these action proposals, and I'll certainly send comments received after today to you guys as well as the committee, all of the committee members. And these proposals are from the public as well as from members, which is why we have a great array of ideas and options. But I appreciate you bringing that up, Andy.
Great, thanks.
I'll just walk through quickly our next steps. As I mentioned at the beginning of our meeting, we won't come back together as a committee until mid-September for a final review of the sector strategies and actions, as Tom alluded to, really integrating with the work of our other groups and having the opportunity to just have a final set of eyes on and review of those actions. So I would just say homework is staying engaged with the climate task force meetings that are coming up. And we mentioned a lot of different follow-ups today that Jason and Brent and I will reach out to you guys and connect on just to further work through some of these great action ideas that you guys have helped us think about today. So that's all I have in terms of next steps. Jason, I'm not sure if you have anything else that you'd like to touch on before we move to public comment.
Lindsay, I'm good. It's been a great discussion.
It's been great. I appreciate everyone hanging with us for so long today. And Glenn asked in the chat if you guys can have our slides, and I'd be glad to send them over next, a little bit later today. So if there's anyone on our Zoom webinar that would like to provide a public comment, I'll also check our climate email. But anyone on our webinar, if you raise your hand, I will admit you to the panel. I don't see any comments yet. Any hands raised? We'll wait one more minute. Jason, I don't see any comments, so I'm going to pass it back over to you.
All right. Well, I just want to thank everyone, as Lindsay just mentioned, just for taking the time. I know it's been a bit of a long meeting today, so thanks for hanging in there with us. And I'll just reiterate some of the stuff that I said in the opening. I think that just coming together and providing comments has been very helpful. I think that this committee has put together just some tremendous actions, and I'm looking forward to working through all of those with you, in addition to working on our comprehensive energy plan, and I always appreciate feedback and the comments. And again, thanks for taking the time and effort to put it and work together and collaboratively in this difficult time. Just I know, again, it's not always easy when we have to do it electronically. So just would encourage you to continue to provide feedback for us, and look forward to continue to work with y'all as we move forward through this process.
Well, thank you, Jason and Lindsay, for all that you're doing behind the scenes to keep us moving forward.
Yep. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, ditto.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you guys so much. Jason, can you call us to adjourn?
And I call for adjournment, please. Anybody second?
Second.
Thanks,
All right,
everyone.
thanks, guys.
Really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. Bye.